Now let us again start off by assuming that the economy initially starts off in a nice equilibrium where the GDP it produces, Y star, let's assume that happens to be exactly the same as that country's potential output, and then let's make this vertical line passing through this potential output, and again you can think of it as the long run aggregate supply of the country, or you can just think of it as a reference line which reminds us where the country's potential output is. Now we have learned that economies, they're usually in the short run and they don't stay at this potential. Instead, economies, they fluctuate and sometimes fall below the country's potential output, and sometimes they move beyond the country's potential output. And the reason for these business cycles, we have learned, are fluctuations in aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand decreases, the economy goes into this recessionary, deflationary gap where the output falls below potential. Whereas if the aggregate demand increases, then the economy moves to an equilibrium such as E3, where it ends up producing an amount of GDP which is even more than that country's potential output. Now these are the short-run business cycles, and we can also depict these short-run business cycles through this business cycle graph. So let's assume that the country has a constant potential output over all of these years. And what these business cycles really mean through, or in terms of the way we depict them through this business cycle graph, is that we just assume that the economy, it will move in business cycles, it will fluctuate around this potential. Sometimes the economy dips below its potential, then it will move beyond its potential, and then again it will come back to its potential, dip below it. For a while it will stay there, and then it will start to recover back towards its potential, and then you will have another upcycle where the economy moves beyond its potential output. So that is how we have learned economies naturally behave. They do go through these business cycles, these short-run fluctuations. Now in terms of macroeconomic policy, we have already looked at monetary and fiscal policies, which we said are demand-side policies. Meaning that through monetary and fiscal policy, the central bank and the government, it simply tries to control this aggregate demand of the country, and they try to push the aggregate demand, either increase or decrease it, in order to try and keep the country out of these business cycles. That is the ultimate target, the ultimate aim of the demand side policies of monetary and fiscal policy. They are trying to manage the country's short-run business cycles by controlling the country's aggregate demand. Monetary and fiscal policy is simply trying to keep the economy as close to its potential as possible. You can show the same ideas and you can depict what monetary and fiscal policy is doing through this business cycle graph. Because all that monetary fiscal policy tries to do is that if your economy goes into this down cycle and it sort of takes around, according to this axis, the down cycle starts in year 0 and it ends in almost year 8. So monetary and fiscal policy would be just an attempt where the government comes in and, given this, situation where the economy is below its potential, such as this point over here, they would implement monetary fiscal policy to try and push the aggregate demand back towards its potential, and therefore they want to get the economy out of this down cycle quicker than what it would take if you leave the economy on its own. So you are basically trying to iron out, you are basically trying to smooth out these business cycles by using monetary and fiscal policy, and you are trying to keep the economy as close to its potential as possible, which is a worthy goal, which is a useful thing to try and achieve, to keep your economy as close to its potential as possible. So that is your demand side policies, an attempt to manage these short-run business cycles. But then you see another very important goal of macroeconomic policy is also to do something that allows or helps the countries to actually increase this potential output after every, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years. Because here we are assuming that your potential output, and therefore this long run aggregate supply, it is fixed, and you're just trying to keep the economy as close to this potential as possible through monetary fiscal demand side policies. But now what I'm saying is that, governments, policymakers, their other concern is that, look, we also have to make policies because of which after every few years our potential output increases. So in terms of business cycle graph, you are saying that if in year 0 this is your potential output, you want that after year 5 maybe the potential output increases a little bit, and then after year 10 the potential output of the country you want it to be increase even more, and similarly after every 5-10 year period you want a gradual increase in the country's potential output, so that your country starts operating at a higher level of GDP. Yes, there would still be fluctuations around that potential output, but here again you would use monetary and fiscal policy to try and keep your economy as close to this higher potential as possible. And now what we want to understand is how can the policymakers help and increase the country's potential output. Now to do that, the policymakers implement or use what are known as supply side policies. Now the reason why these are known as supply side policies, attempts by the government to increase the country's potential output, the reason is that, you see, when the country if it is successful in increasing the country's potential output, and remember we have learned that whenever potential output increases, then the aggregate supply of the economy will also increase and it will shift to the right, since the greater your potential output, the greater your productive capacity, the greater the amount of total output the firms will be able to produce at each price level. So supply side policies, therefore remember, basically the concept, the target, the broad vision is that you are trying to increase the country's potential output, country's productive capacity. But whenever you do that, and if you are successful, if potential output increases, then the country's aggregate supply also increases and shifts to the right. Hence the name supply side policies. Now these supply side policies, remember, they are not there to control these business cycles. Because theoretically, yes, you see, if you are in a deflationary gap, instead of trying to increase your aggregate demand, you can also try to sort of, at this starting from this point, you can try to increase aggregate supply, implement supply side policies, and therefore get the economy back to its potential. But that is not the aim of supply side policies. You don't try to control business cycle through supply side policies. And the reason is that if you think about what are the sort of things that can achieve this increase in potential output and therefore an increase in aggregate supply, then usually all such things, all such policies would require a lot of time and they would be very difficult to implement. So they are not quick policies, these supply side policies. It's not like you can quickly come in and quickly, control and move your aggregate supply around. So supply side policies, therefore remember, they are pursued as a long-term goal to increase the country's potential output. Whereas to manage these short-run business cycles, you stick to demand side policies. You stick to monetary fiscal policy because it is much easier and much quicker to quickly have control over aggregate demand. Now, if you think about what are the sort of things that can cause an increase in potential output and the country's aggregate supply, then remember we have already learned that in order to achieve these two things, you either have to lower the cost of production in the country. So any policy that can help achieve a lowering of cost of production qualifies or is known as a supply side policy. Whereas primarily what supply side policies mean are those policies through which the government tries to either improve or increase the quality or the quantity of the country's 4 resources of land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Because basically it is only when I shouldn't say it is only, but primarily, the way that you try to increase the country's potential output and productive capacity is by improving the quantity and quality of your country's resources. Or you can also try to do things because of which the state of technology that is available to the economy, if you can increase or improve that state of technology, that would also mean that your country overall would be able to produce a larger amount of goods. Its potential output, its productive capacity will increase, and therefore the aggregate supply will shift to the right. Now, in order to increase the, let's say, quality of your country's resources, you can pursue a lot of different supply side policies. So again, remember, this can be a bit of a circular sort of an explanation over here, but supply side policies, anything that allows you to achieve either increase in quantity, quality of resources or technology, or anything that allows you to lower the cost of production, they all count as supply side policies, because either of these things ultimately will increase the potential output and shift the country's aggregate supply to the right. Now let me give you some examples of what some specific supply side policies can be, and as I take you through those examples, I will highlight to you as to how each of these different supply side policies will be costly, time consuming and difficult to implement, again reinforcing the idea that supply side policies are pursued as a long-term goal. Now, the major supply side policy that many countries tries to implement over the long term is to try and improve the quality of the labor force by increasing the amount of education. And let me write it in yellow. So these are the specific supply side policies in yellow. You can either increase the amount of education that you have available in your country, you can improve the quantity or amount of skills and provide more training to your labor force, and you can also work towards improving the health of your labor force, because a healthier labor force also means a better quality of labor force. Now you see, if you are able to do all of these things, then yes, your labor will become more productive, its quality will increase, and therefore you would be able to make a larger amount, your potential output will increase, your actual aggregate supply will also shift to the right. So that these are all supply side policies. But if you think about improving the education or giving training and skills to your people, then it is much more easy to say this than to actually practically do this. Because if you today decide to educate your population by making, let's say, more schools and hiring more teachers, then this is a very long-term policy, because today if you start building a school, first it will take at least 2-3 years for the building to be ready, then you'll have to hire teachers, and then you will have to spend time on those students. It's not like you educate them today and tomorrow their quality improves. No. You have to take these children who are recruited into these schools, you have to take them through the usual education process of 10, 15, 16 years before you will start seeing the results of trying to increase education in terms of improved labor force and therefore an increased productive capacity of the country. And then your education and skills and training that you provide people in these 10-15 years over the long term, all of these things have to be relevant. As in, you have to give those skills and those trainings to people that are relevant 20 years from now and 10 years from now. And you have to find the right skilled trainers to impart these trainings. So all of these things again and again highlight the same issue, that these supply side policies, they are long term, they are difficult to implement, and then there is a lot of cost involved. Many poor countries, they do want to increase the amount of education, skills, training, and therefore improve the quality of their labor, but they just don't have enough funds to be able to afford to do that. Now the same thing applies to the supply side policies that try to improve the health and therefore the quality of your country's labor. You have to make hospitals, you have to provide free health services, you have to spend money to do all of these things, and again, poor countries, they don't have the money to look after the health of their people. Poor governments, they don't have the money to run free dispensaries and free hospitals. So again, the supply side policy where you try to improve the quality of labor by improving the health of your labor force, again a long-term policy, a costly thing, takes a lot of time before it actually starts showing results. Now as far as increasing the quantity of your resources is concerned, you see the government can go for improving the infrastructure of the country, meaning the government can spend on making bridges and roads and transportation networks and seaports, airports, and then telecommunication networks and internet facilities and maybe dams and power plants. So all of these counts as the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the physical capital that is available to the country. So if you want to increase the country's productive capacity and increase the potential output and therefore shift the aggregate supply to the right, you can start making more infrastructure and you can start accumulating capital. But again, this won't happen overnight. It takes years to make these dams and bridges and add infrastructure to the country because there are a lot of issues involved. First, there is a lot of money that has to be arranged, so there is a lot of money that is required, and then obviously you have to plan all of these huge projects, which will obviously take a lot of time. So again, highlighting the same thing, supply side policies, anything you try to increase quantity, quality of your country's resources and increase the potential output, possible, but takes a lot of time. Then as far as labor's quantity is concerned, we have talked about how you can increase the quality of labor, but you can also do things to try and increase the quantity of the country's labor force. Now, to increase the quantity of labor force, something that a lot of developing countries can do is that they can try to increase the rate of female labor force participation. Because in many developing countries, half of the women or most of the women, they don't work. So if you can bring in policies such as, extended maternity leave and options for legislations which allow women to have flexible working hours and working schedules, and if you allow women to take long maternity leaves, and if the government provides good what they are called child care facilities so that women can leave their children in those child care centers and then go and work, then all of these policies ultimately will lead to more female participating in the labor force, and that would increase the quantity of labor in your country. And that if that happens, and when that happens, your productive capacity will increase since you will have more of this resource of labor. But again, all of these policies take a lot of time. You can't just announce that we are making more daycare centers, so therefore women should start participating in the labor force. This policy, if it has to work, then it needs a continuous sustained effort from the government to advertise these things, to make more and more attractions for the females to come and join the labor force, and obviously all of this will take time. So it is possible to increase the quantity of labor, but it is difficult. Now there are other ways through which you can try to increase the quantity of labor. Maybe you can start promoting immigration policies where countries, they open up their borders and try to encourage immigration and try to encourage people to come in and work and settle in their countries. So that is what most of the developed countries, rich countries, they actually do. They are running out of labor, so they make immigration policies where they try to attract highly skilled workers from all over the world. Again, this is a policy that will need time. It takes time before you can start advertising to the world that, look, we are open for immigration and we are here providing good opportunities, and over the years then gradually you will start attracting immigrants. When that happens, yes, your labor will increase, potential output will increase, and the country's aggregate supply will shift to the right. But again, it will take a lot of time. And then you can also think in terms of trying to improve the technology available to the country, because if your country has better technology, then it would be able to get more out of its resources, and therefore it would be able to increase its potential output. Now, to increase or improve the state of technology, the sort of supply side policies the government can use are things where the government sort of sponsors or encourages research and development. So maybe the government can give scholarships to university professors to conduct research and development. Maybe they can give scholarships or grants and funds to specific industrial sectors, such as the technology sectors and the IT sector and the export-oriented sector. The government sometimes encourages them and gives them grants and funds and facilities to carry out research and development. And the purpose of all the sponsorship of research and development by the governments is that, look, if you can come up with some new technology, with some new technique, with some new ways or means of doing things and making products, then ultimately that would mean that your economy would become more efficient, and if it has better technology through this research and development, then ultimately you will be able to get more out of your country's resources, meaning that your potential output, your productive capacity will increase, and your aggregate supply will shift to the right. So all of these different things that I have been telling you, remember, they are all supply side policies. Anything that can achieve either of these changes in quantity, quality of resources, and therefore increase the country's potential output, they are all known as supply side policies. So overall, therefore, remember that the way the policymakers manage the country's economy through demand side and supply side policies, the way or what they are trying to do is that they are trying to keep the economy's fluctuations as small as possible. They are trying to keep the economy at any given point in time in the short run. They want to keep the economy as close to its potential output as possible. And they achieve that through managing the country's aggregate demand and using the demand side policies of monetary and fiscal policy. So short run business cycle management, you control the country's aggregate demand to achieve that. Whereas then separately as a long-term policy, you pursue these supply side policies with the aim that over the years, if our supply side policies succeed and if we are able to increase the quantity and quality of resources or the state of technology, then the country's potential output will increase, and as a result the aggregate supply will also shift to the right.